like standing up here teaching class, but for recording purposes, I don't think they're going to want my face right in the camera down there, so we're going to do it this way, I guess. If you noticed on Facebook, I had a poll up as to how we wanted to continue our Bible study, and thus far, the vote has been very lopsided to go ahead and continue kind of covering this set material where it speeds it up a bit. And the goal is, if you're familiar with some of the material that the kids use in the back, that's basically what we're basing it off of. But the goal is to study through the entire Bible. And of course, it's going to double our time to try to do that. I think the ones in the back, are they 4 year? Is that what they're set up for? So it's going to take us 8 years to go through the entire Bible. But I've been here. I was thinking this is my 13th year, and we were only in 1 Samuel, so it's got to speed up a little bit, right? Anyway, we're looking at a sheet that is entitled David Gives Instructions for the Temple, and it's based upon 1 Chronicles chapters 22 through 29, so obviously we're not going to be able to read all those verses tonight and explore all within those chapters, but it's kind of try to get you an idea of some of the events and how you can put them into order and kind of be familiar with these Old Testament events and the stories surrounding them. And so we're going to start in 1 Chronicles chapter 22 tonight. And 1 Chronicles 22, and we're going to I'm going to have people read if they will. I'm going to listen to it later and see how good it picks up on the recording or not. I'm guessing it probably won't unless you read very loudly. But if it doesn't, then we might switch it up differently. I don't like to do all the talking, so hopefully you guys can help me out in that area. But if somebody will, let's read verses 1 through 5 there, 1 Chronicles 22.
Then David said, "This is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of the burnt offering for Israel." And David commanded to gather together the strangers that were in the land of Israel. And he set mansions to new brought stones to build the house of God. And David prepared iron in abundance for the nails, for the doors of the gates, and for the joinings, and brass in abundance with weight. Also cedar trees in abundance for the Zidonians, and they are brought much cedar wood to David. And David said, "Solomon, my son, is young and tender, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent of frame and glory throughout all countries. I will therefore now make preparation for it." So David prepared abundantly before his death.
Okay, so question number 1 on our handout here is what decision did David make about the threshing floor site and how it would be used in the future? Really wasn't just a decision that David himself made, but it was a decision that was made by God. You remember last week when we were studying about David numbering the people, that God had David, or tried to get David to choose a punishment that would come upon him. And of course, David didn't want to do that, but remember, it ended up being the plague on the people. And as the angel of the Lord was getting close to Jerusalem, somehow or other, David was allowed to see this. God stayed the hand of that angel and told him to go and to buy Araunah's threshing floor and to set up an altar and to sacrifice to God there. And so what was special about that site in the future? Yeah, it was going to be the place where the temple was built, wasn't it? It was going to be the place of sacrifice for all of Israel. And of course, if you look back just a little bit, we've kind of studied throughout the Old Testament how a lot of people think, immediately when the children of Israel entered the promised land, that boom, Jerusalem is the capital and that's where everybody worshiped God. But it actually started in Shiloh. The tabernacle was set up first in Shiloh. Then it was moved later on to Gibeon. Probably Shiloh was destroyed in the attack whenever the Ark of the Covenant was taken that we read about in the days of Saul. But also, eventually, it's going to be moved to Jerusalem. And if you go back in chapter 21 and you look, don't have time to look at a bunch of verses, but let's just look at verse 28 there. It says, "At that time when David saw that the Lord had answered him in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, then he sacrificed there. For the tabernacle of the Lord which Moses made in the wilderness and the altar of the burnt offerings were at that season in the high place at Gibeon. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid because of the sword of the angel of the Lord." So what happened is David was afraid to pass by this place because he knew that's where God had stopped that angel in carrying out the punishment of Israel. And in order to get to Gibeon, the problem was you had to travel through this spot. And so eventually this would become the site that God chose for the temple to be built there and worship to be established there. And you can look a little, well, just turn over real quickly here. Let's go over to 2 Chronicles 3 and verse 1. It says, "Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite." And so this is, you go over to chapter 7, you can read in verses 2 Chronicles 7, 11, and 12, how God told Solomon that this was to be the place that he was to build it. And so it became a significant place. It became a place where men could come and worship God, and eventually the temple itself would be built. Question number 2. So what pre-construction steps did David take in order to build this temple to God? Now remember, all that they had before the temple was the tabernacle, this movable tent or structure. But the temple became a permanent place of worship. So what steps did David take to prepare the temple? Okay, what kind of materials did we read about in gathering? Yeah, stones. What else? Cedars.
Nails. Iron.
Yes, iron for the nails.
Brass.
And brass. So David, prior to the building of this temple, David was really responsible for a lot of the materials that were used in the construction of the temple itself. Not only did he arrange the materials, but of course he also designated the people who were working in those areas. And who was it mainly that were employed in the gathering of these resources together? Did you catch that?
I thought the strangers, I thought that would meant the non-Israelites they sort of made the treaty with, the woodcutters and water carriers. And I sort of took this to be like conscript labor, like you don't have a choice, you're going to go do this.
Yeah. So you're thinking of the Gibeonites, is it?
I'm not sure which one it was.
I think that was the group that deceived Israel when they were going to the promised land, pretended to come from a faraway country, and they made a covenant with them. And eventually Israel found out, and part of their punishment was that they would be woodcutters and drawers of water. That was they were going to be spared, but that was their job. But it wasn't uncommon in this day and age, if you had foreigners or strangers living within your country, to basically put them to work on what we would call state projects. I mean, you think about Israel when they were in Egypt, that's what they worked on, didn't they? They worked on these buildings and this construction. And so I don't know if it was part of the agreement with some of these foreigners that would be their job, if they were allowed to live within Israel, or these were people who were placed under contract whenever Israel came in and made these covenants with the different people of the land instead of destroying them.
Yeah, over in Kings, they talk when Solomon got to be king, he paid these people because that were working for him. There were 70,000 in the people cutting wood, like 80,000 people hewing stone, and they had hired them. That was, I think most of them come from him, or that's what it applied there.
Okay.
That's in First Kings, like that's 5 and 6. That's the next Wednesday, or that Sunday morning lesson.
Okay, so I figure that there were at least people within the nation overseeing the labor itself. So
They said 3,300.
yeah, it's astounding. I mean, when you think about all the
50,000 people working on this.
Yeah.
7 years.
Yeah, and it wasn't like it was built in a year. It took 7 years. Yeah, but it had to be an amazing structure for that day and age.
It wasn't that big.
No, it wasn't, but it would have been a sight to behold with all the artistry within it and the woodwork and the metalworking and everything.
Everything overlaid with gold.
Yeah. So basically, what David does is, he starts gathering and getting all these materials ready for the construction of the temple. And question number 3 on your sheet is, why didn't David leave all the preparations to his son Solomon?
He's too young to have experience.
Yeah, Solomon was just getting ready to become king, and so he wasn't somebody who probably had been over a lot of building projects. First of all, probably didn't know all the things that were involved in it. He had a lot to learn while he would, or before he became a king of Israel here, and so David felt that he needed some more instruction and he needed some more training. And what kind of building is David building here, or Solomon building here? Yeah, it's not just going to be like any other structure in Jerusalem. This is going to be the greatest building that has been built within the nation of Israel itself. And so David knows that it has to be the most magnificent building in Israel. He wants nations to talk about it and people to wonder at it. And so just think, if you were Solomon, how difficult a job that would be when you first entered into the office of being a king, to have to construct, the most famous building and the most magnificent building in all of your entire nation. Well, David understood that, and so he took some steps beforehand to kind of help Solomon out and get things prepared.
Well, David really wanted to be one to build a temple, but God said he had man forward, he wasn't going to build it. So I guess this is his way of kind of contributing to that. I guess the next best thing, try to get it stuff up to do it, because God said he could do it.
Yeah, we'll talk about a little later on. I want to save just a little bit to have some more discussion down here. But of course, as we read, David wasn't allowed to do it. But you think about David and Solomon. It's a great example of unity, isn't it? They each contributed and they each had a significant role, but roles were different. But yet there were great contributions to raising this magnificent structure for God. And so, good example for us of the idea of the cooperative spirit that David had, even though he wasn't allowed to build the temple itself. Somebody read for us verses 6 through 14 here in chapter 22. 1 Chronicles 22.
Then he called for Solomon his son and charged him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, my son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house unto the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thou hast shed blood abundantly, and hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build a house unto my name, because thou hast shed much blood upon the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to thee, he shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his enemies round about, for his name shall be Solomon. And I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days. He shall build a house in my name, and he shall be my son. I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. Now, my son, the Lord be with thee, and prosper thou, and build the house of the Lord thy God, as he has said of thee. Only the Lord give thee wisdom and understanding, give thee charge concerning Israel, that thou mayest keep the law of the Lord thy God. Then shalt thou prosper, if thou takest heed to fulfill statutes and judgments which the Lord charged Moses with concerning Israel. Be strong, of good courage, dread not, nor be dismayed. Now, behold, in my trouble I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, and 1,000,000 talents of silver, and of brass and iron without weight, for it is abundance. Timber also and stone have I prepared, and thou mayest add thereto.
Okay, so number 4 on our sheet here, according to David, why was Solomon to build the temple?
He was a man of rest, not of war.
Okay, and let's narrow it down to even a simpler explanation than that. That's kind of the detailed explanation of it, right?
Well, at this time, Clint, was Solomon the intellect natural person that he was going to become. He wasn't, right?
Yeah, not yet, because he hadn't yet been appointed king. There'd been kind of a pre-ceremony, I guess you could say, to appoint him king, but it really wasn't the official appointment yet. So how would you just simplify that?
God said so?
Yeah. I mean, that's God said, right? That's why David told Solomon that he was to build the temple. And so, like Steve pointed out, David he had every intention in his mind and his heart to build this house, but God wouldn't let him. And so the word of God comes to him and says, you can't build this temple, but I'm going to allow your son to build it for me. And so God didn't allow him to build it, but he did allow his son. And, again, we read the reason as to why that is. But when you think about who was best qualified to do it, and I'm not necessarily talking at this point in time, but I'm talking later on after Solomon gains all this wisdom, do you think that was a better decision? That Solomon was the one who would build this elaborate house than David? Yeah, I think the foreknowledge of God knew those things. And, again, you kind of think about the idea, or I was thinking about the idea concerning David, likening him to the Apostle Paul. And, Paul was made an apostle for Christ. Did he get to choose who he went to?
No.
What group mainly did he go to? The Gentiles, right? Remember God told Ananias that Acts 9:15 that he'd made Saul a chosen vessel to go to the Gentiles. Who do you think Paul would have chosen to go to if he got the choice? Jews, right? I mean, you read in Romans, we studied on Sunday morning, the great desire that he had for their salvation. The problem was this: what would have happened to Paul if he went to the Jews? They'd have killed him, right? They ended up really killing him anyway. But I mean, if he had just dealt primarily with the Jews, they would have taken his life so quickly, he wouldn't have been very effective. And so God knew that, and in his foreknowledge, he designated him to go and to preach to the Gentiles. And I think that's kind of the same situation when you think about Solomon here. God had some things in mind, obviously, as we read, some reasoning, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But ultimately, down the road, when you think about the wisdom of Solomon and his understanding and, all those things, Solomon was probably the best choice that you could have ever chosen among any man in Israel to build this great and magnificent structure to be remembered. Number 5 here. So what instructions did David give Solomon about his relationship with God? Let's do this. What was that relationship based upon?
Following God, the laws and statutes of God.
Yeah, that was his advice, wasn't it? He says, you got to be obedient to God. If you'll be obedient to God, God will be with you. He'll give you wisdom. He'll give you discernment. He'll give you understanding. But if you're going to succeed as a king and in building this great temple for God, you have to be obedient to him. And so, it's a good lesson for us, because undoubtedly David longed for all of his children to be faithful and obedient and steadfast to God. But it's interesting when he gets this chance to talk to Solomon about it, that this is his emphasis. If you're going to succeed in everything that you do as a king, you've got to be obedient to God. And when you think about it, our success in the end, that's what it's going to be based upon, isn't it? Our relationship with God, whether we've been obedient to him or not. And if we want to succeed, we've got to be like Solomon. We've got to be faithful and steadfast to the Lord. Let's turn over to chapter 28 here and read another few verses. Somebody read for us 1 Chronicles 28 and verses 1 through 7.
Now David assembled at Jerusalem all the leaders of Israel, the officers of the tribes and the captains of the divisions, to serve the king. The captains over thousands and captains over hundreds, and the stewards of all the substance and possessions of the king and his sons, with the officials, the valiant men, and all the mighty men of valor. Then King David rose to his feet and said, Hear me, my brethren and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and for the footstool of our God, God said to me, you shall not build a house for my name, because you have been a man of war and have shed blood. However, the Lord God of Israel chose me above all the house of my father to be king over Israel forever, for he has chosen Judah to be the ruler. And now in the house of Judah, the house of my father, and among the sons of my father, he was pleased with me to make me king over all Israel. And all of my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. Now he said to me, it is your son Solomon who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. Moreover, I will establish his kingdom forever, if he is steadfast to observe my commandments and my judgments, as it is this day.
Okay, so question number 6 is, how did David get to be king of Israel? Yeah, God chose him, right? Just like God chose Saul in the beginning. And I think a lot of times when we read about the succession of these kings, we think, well, Israel was totally responsible for the appointment of these kings. But at least the first few that Israel enjoyed, God divinely chose these men. And so he'd chosen Saul. He also chose David. And while David didn't get to build the temple of God, here's David and he's talking to the people. And he said, this is what I really wanted to do. And I had these great plans to build this temple. But he also emphasizes, he's not totally disappointed. And he's not in despair, because God has made this tremendous promise to him about his kingdom. And of course, what he's talking about there is what? What kind of promise did David get about his kingdom?
It lasts forever.
Yeah, it will last forever. You remember whenever Jacob is blessing his sons back in Egypt in Genesis 49 and verse 10. One of the things that he says about Judah is that the scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh come. Judah was the tribe that was chosen through whom Christ would come. And so here's David, and he's from the tribe of Judah, and it goes back to something we studied a couple weeks ago on Sunday morning, the divine sovereignty of God. God's in control. He gets to choose who he wants. And so he had to choose somebody in the tribe of Judah to bring about Christ, and he chose David's family. And so when he talks about this kingdom that he's going to give David that's going to last forever, he's talking about Jesus and the church that would be built through him. And so David says, I'm not without hope. I'm not totally disappointed or without despair because of this great promise that God has made for me and for my kingdom. Number 7, so who would be the next king after David? Solomon. And why was that?
God said so.
God chose him, right? David said, I've got a lot of sons. God blessed him to have many children. But there was only one who could be king of Israel, who could succeed in his lineage. And so God chose Solomon as the one who would be David's successor. Question number 8, what task did God have for Solomon while he was king?
To build a temple and his courts.
Okay, so first thing we read about is to build his temple. What else? Anything else you pick up on in there?
Do his commandments.
Yes, do his commandments. Anything else?
Be good, of good courage.
Okay.
Dread not.
Yes.
Don't be dismayed.
Yes.
A lot of life lessons there for all of us.
Yeah, it's kind of reminiscent of, when the leadership of Israel is switching from Moses to Joshua. It's kind of reminiscent of Moses' words to Joshua. Be strong, be courageous. Don't be dismayed. Keep God's word. Anything else that stand out to you there?
Don't you think this first few verses here, essentially, it starts out with David calling all the who's who before him as leaders and making this speech. It looks to me like he's getting everybody on the boat before he hands the reins over to Solomon, so they all support what Solomon's about trying to accomplish here.
Yeah.
This is sort of I want you to get behind my son in this. This is from God.
Yeah, and David had such a difficult time, getting everybody together and unified, and that was really, well, in part due to his shortcomings, but it was he knew the difficult task that lay before Solomon, And I think he also knew if this temple was going to get built, people were going to have to work together. There's no way that Solomon was ever going to be able to accomplish this on his own, or just half the nation behind him. Because you read about the amount of wealth that's poured into this construction, and again, it would take an entire nation to do that. If you look down in verse 6, there's something I think that we don't always pick up on, but it's kind of interesting. He says to Solomon, Solomon thy son, he shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son. You ever think about that statement? Because part of the reason that David wasn't allowed to build God's house or God's temple was because he was a man who had shed a lot of blood, right? Now, you think back to a lot of these wars that David was involved in. Were they ungodly? No. But the reality of it was that David had just killed a lot of people. And I think what is being said here, and well, I know when you study the idea, I talk a lot about the types and the antitypes of the Bible. But Solomon was a type of Jesus. He was a type of God's son. And Jesus, when he came, he was going to build God's temple, the church. And so Solomon had to be like him. He had to have a person who resembled his son. David was a guy who killed lots, shed a lot of blood. That doesn't accurately represent Jesus. But what does he say about the reign of Solomon? Do you remember? Peace.
Be quiet.
Yes, tranquility, right? And so the temple was going to be a place of peace and tranquility. It's going to be a place of life, not death. And so part of the reason I think that he chose Solomon, again, the great wisdom of God, all these types and antitypes, you study the Old Testament, God was foreshadowing greater things to come. And so I think that's part of the reason what he's talking about there when he's talking about David being that man of war and being a bloody man. I'm going to choose a man of peace, a man of tranquility. And so he chose Solomon. And he also said he was going to establish his kingdom forever. Again, the continuing promise through the lineage of David. Let's go over to chapter 29 here. Anybody got any thoughts or comments or questions or anything?
It's kind of ironic, Clint, I think that here we have Solomon, who is going to become the second smartest or most intellectual person in the world, and most Christ-like in that capacity, and then he goes so far to the extreme the other way when he had it all right there.
Yeah.
Everything that you could ask for, the wealth, the wisdom, to know so many things, and then to fall the way he did.
Yeah, and that's just the allure of the world. I mean, it's the physical things. They pull at you strong. And it doesn't matter how much head knowledge you have, it still takes willpower, doesn't it? And at least Solomon did repent in the end. That's the good thing. Let's go over to chapter 29. Somebody read for us verses 1 through 6.
Then King David said to the entire assembly, "My son Solomon, whom alone God has chosen, is still young and inexperienced, and the work is great. For the temple is not for man, but for the Lord God. Now with all my ability I have provided for the house of my God the gold for the things of gold, silver for the things of silver, and the bronze for the things of bronze, the iron for the things of iron, and the wood for the things of wood, onyx stones and inlaid stones, stones of antimony and stones of various colors, and all kinds of precious stones and alabaster in abundance. Moreover, in my delight in the house of my God, the treasure I have of gold and silver, I give to the house of my God over and above all that I've already provided for the holy temple, namely 3,000 talents of gold of Ophir, 7,000 talents of refined silver to overlay the walls of the building, of gold for the things of gold, and of silver for the things of silver, that is, for all the work done by the craftsman, who then is willing to consecrate himself this day to the Lord." You see 6?
Yes, sir.
Then the rulers of the fathers' household, and the princes of the tribes of Israel, and the commanders of thousands of hundreds, with the overseers over the king's work, offered willingly.
Okay, so question number 9, we've kind of covered that. Some of these are repetitive, but according to David, what made Solomon's task great? He was young, he was inexperienced. The task was enormous that was at hand. Like we said, not just another building going up in Jerusalem. Question 10. So what resources had David, and I'm talking about David personally, provided for the building of the temple?
His own silver and gold.
Yeah, and how much?
A lot.
A bunch.
Okay, so gold it said he had 3,000 talents. Anybody have an idea of what that would be?
Talents, isn't it 75 pounds? Isn't that about right?
I don't know.
I think it's 75 pounds. That's 1,200 ounces. I know my little calculator won't go to that many zeros. It's about $1,600 an ounce. So.
Yeah, so it depends. Again, the talent of gold, and versus a talent of silver or a talent of brass, you're talking about a different amount as to how much that would be. I mean, as much far as you could pick it up. But this, it's probably one of the most generous gifts you'll ever read about in the Bible. David just gave a tremendous sum out of his own pocket, out of his own treasure, for the construction of God's house. So he gives this great amount of gold. He gives this tremendous amount of silver. What else is mentioned there?
We'll talk about
Yes, iron. That's the one I couldn't see. Kind of glistening off my paper here. Iron. So, it wasn't that David was, before he asked the people to give anything, he gives himself. And why do you think that is? Why do you think he told this to the people? We're trying to brag? Yeah, he was trying to get them to understand the importance of it, right? He's trying to motivate them to give very freely. And so before he allows any of the officers or the rest of Israel to contribute to this, he gives this, or he tells this, personally, I've given all these things to the service of God. Let's read, go ahead and read verses 10 through 14. 1 Chronicles 29, 10 through 14. Somebody, please.
Wherefore David blessed the Lord for all the congregation. And David said, Blessed be thou, Lord God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Thine, O Lord, is the greatness, and the power, and the glory, and the victory, and the majesty. For all that is in the heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord, and thou art exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come of thee, and thou reignest over all. And in thy hand is power and might, and in thy hand it is to make great, and to give strength unto all. Now therefore, our God, we thank thee, and praise thy glorious name. But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able to offer so willingly after the sword? For all things come of thee, and of thine own have we given thee.
Okay, so how did David describe this situation that lay before him and the people in contributing to this building of the temple?
Humble. Very humble.
Yeah, it was a privilege, just to be able to do this. It wasn't that David was braggadocious about what he was doing here and how much he had given, but he's like, who are we? Who are we to be allowed to contribute to this construction of this magnificent building for God, for all generations to worship our Lord in? And so, he viewed it, he emphasized everything that we have has been given to us by God. It's not like we're giving him anything special. We're just returning a portion of the things that he's already given to us. But to be able to give so freely, as he had been able to do, and for the people to be able to do that, God had really put them in a special position. And it's a good lesson for us because, we need to think about the idea how generous are we toward God? You know, how generous are we with our time that God has given to us here upon this earth? How generous are we with our talents that God has blessed us with here upon this earth? You know, how generous are we with the money that God has given us here upon this earth? David viewed it as a privilege to be able to contribute, didn't he? And if we'll think about contributing that way too, that'll help us a long way in the Christian walk. All right, so obviously we didn't read the last section, but it's pretty straightforward there. If you want to go ahead and read those 7 verses. Anybody have any comments, any questions, or anything